So how can we ensure that the user is not able to submit empty data in the add resource component? Well, of course, we got our free entered input values, and we can add a if check and check if entered title is empty, or to be precise, I will even call trim on it, which is a built-in method that exists in JavaScript, which you can call on strings to remove excess whitespace at the beginning and end. This avoids that the user enters a bunch of blanks, and that would be treated as valid. Trim will remove those excess blanks and will therefore still give us an empty input. So that's why I'm checking it like this. And if that's the case, or if entered description once we trim it is empty, or if entered URL trimmed is empty, if any of that is the case, then I know the input is invalid. Now for one, I will return then to avoid that this line of code here executes, because returning stops the function execution. But in addition, I also want to show my alert. And I could do this with the built-in alert function, but I want to have my own custom dialog, which looks a bit nicer. And therefore, I will add a new component, and I will actually add it in the UI folder, a base dialog.view file, which could be used for anything, but which I will use for showing an error message. Now in this base dialog.view file, in the template, I will add the built-in dialog HTML element and add the open attribute already so that it's always open, but will then control visibility by adding or removing base dialog to and from the DOM. And here in the dialog, it's now totally up to you how you want to structure this. I will add a header element here, and in that header, I will add a slot so that the user is able to set the header. But I will actually also provide a default content between the slot tags, which will be used if no header would be provided. And there, I'll even take it to the next level, and I'll output a title property, which I expect to get as props. So here I'll add the props key and expect a title prop on this component. This gives us as a developer full flexibility. When using the base dialog, we can either just provide the title prop, or we provide our totally customized HTML structure, which will then be inserted in this header slot. So we can do both. Use the default with our own custom text, or override it entirely and not just provide our own text, but also our own HTML code that should be used in the header. And therefore, I'll actually add my prop differently here and be very clear about the fact that title is optional. Its type is string, but it's definitely not required. You don't have to provide a title prop because, of course, you might also just provide your own HTML content for this slot. Now, after the header, I'll add a section, and this will hold the main content of this dialog. Here again, I want to give us as a developer as much flexibility as possible, and we should be able to bring our own HTML code. Hence, this is again time for a slot, but since we now have two slots, we need named slots. One slot may remain unnamed, but all other slots need names. So I'll name this slot here header because it is our header slot after all. And then I'll add a third part in this dialog. After header and the main section, I'll add a menu element, which again is a default HTML element, where I want to allow the user to display buttons, which the user can press. And again, the HTML code should be provided by us as a developer. So here I will also give this a name, actions, and now we can pass our own HTML code in here. Now I'm only using this dialog in one place in this app, and therefore we don't have to build it as flexible as we're doing it here. But of course, this is about practicing this all, and this is about showing you how you could build a really reusable dialog, which you could then use in different places of your app and use and configure it in a totally different way every time you as a developer use it. That's why I'm building it in this highly flexible way here. And I also don't just want to have the dialog, I also want to have a backdrop behind it. So I want to make sure that the page behind the dialog is grayed out. For that, I'll add a div here next to the dialog, like this. And with that added, we can add some styling, which I of course also prepared for you. I'll add my scoped styles again, as always. And attached you find this dialog CSS file. As always, it contains a bunch of CSS rules, which you simply should copy and paste between your style tags here. And that will give the dialog and the header and this backdrop the desired styling. With that, we have a base dialog here. Now let's see how we can use it. And first of all, I will of course register it globally so that we could use it everywhere in this app. So in main.js, I'll import base dialog from /components UI base dialog.view and then add it with app component base dialog and point at my base dialog config object. With that, the dialog is registered. Now in add resource, we can use it. And here it should be shown if the user entered something invalid. For that, I'll add my data property here to the add resource component. And the one piece of data I want to manage in here is information about whether the user input is invalid or not. So I will name my property here input is invalid. And initially that's false, because initially the user input isn't invalid yet, because the user didn't have a chance of entering anything. But I'll set this to true if we make it into this if check. So if at least one of these inputs is empty, then I'll set this input is invalid to true. And now we can use this newly added property to toggle our dialog. Here, next to base card, I will add the base dialog like this. And I'll show it with vif if input is invalid is true. And now we can provide content for our different slots. Now, I will actually not provide my own header slot. Instead, there I want to utilize this default fallback and just set my own title text. Therefore, I'll set the title prop on the base dialog and set it to invalid input. But I do want to provide HTML content for the other two slots. So here, I'll now add a template tag and target the default slot with this shorthand. The alternative would be vslot:default, but you can use this shorthand. And between here, I want to have a paragraph where I say, unfortunately, at least one input value is invalid. And add another paragraph here where I say, please check all inputs and make sure you enter at least a few characters into each input field. Something like this. Of course, the error message is up to you. And now we also need a second template here to provide the content for the second slot we have, for this actions slot. So here with vslot actions or using the shorthand, we can tell Vue that the content inside of this template should go into that slot. And there I want to have one base button where I simply say, OK. And I add a click listener to this button. And now I want to trigger a method which allows us to close this dialog. So therefore here I will register a new method, the confirm error method, for example, where we set this input is invalid back to false, which will then close the dialog. And confirm error should be triggered if this button here is clicked, this button in the actions of our dialog. With all of that, if we save that and reload this page, and we go to add resources and we try to submit this, we should see our dialog. And clicking OK closes it. Now, it would be great if clicking the backdrop would also close it, but currently that's not happening. So let's add this functionality to the base dialog, and therefore on this div, I will add a click listener. The div here is our backdrop, where I want to emit a custom event, which I'll name close. And of course, this custom event name is up to you. And actually, I will also stay here and add a fallback content to my actions slot, even though we don't need it for the way we use it here, but to make this really reusable. And I'll add a base button here as a fallback content where I say close and where upon a click I also emit this close custom event. So that if the user would not provide any content for the actions slot, this button would be shown at least. And now with that, I will just let Vue know about our emitted custom event, about the close event, by adding the emits option to this config object. And now with that, we can go back to add resource, where we are using the base dialog, and we can now listen to this close event on this dialog. And when this event occurs, I want to run my confirm error method. So the same method we execute when this OK button is clicked. And therefore now with that added, if we save this and we reload this page, if I go back here and submit an empty form, I can now also close the dialog by clicking on the backdrop. And of course also still by using the OK button. And on the other hand, if we enter something valid here, so if we do not provide invalid input, creating the resource still works. So with that, there's only one last thing left, and that is deleting resources. We'll implement that as a next step together.